I think it is a good thing. I mean, there were periods, like at the breakup of the Beatles where we weren't so friendly, so you couldn't do anything like this then because the sort of hurt feelings and stuff like that would have crept in.
Betrayal, rivalry, and even homicide. Behind Paul McCartney's easy smile lies a hidden list of names he could never forgive. To the world, he is the friendly Beatle, but privately, he carried wounds that shaped his music and his life. From a pop icon who stole his catalog, to a slayer who stole his brother in song, McCartney's blacklist is more real than most fans ever imagined. Today, we uncover 8 figures he truly despised, ranked from the most shocking to the least. Number 8. Mark David Chapman. On the night of December 8, 1980, Paul McCartney's life and the dream of millions was shattered by a man he never even met. Mark David Chapman, a troubled fan carrying a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, waited outside the Dakota Building in New York City. Earlier that evening, Chapman had asked John Lennon for an autograph, receiving a smile and signature without protest. Hours later, when John returned home with Yoko Ono, Chapman stepped out of the shadows and fired 5 shots. 4 hit their mark. John Lennon, Paul's oldest musical partner, collapsed in his wife's arms and never stood up again. For Paul, the moment was indescribable. Reporters swarmed him for a statement, desperate for raw grief. Caught off guard, Paul muttered, "It's a drag," a phrase that instantly became headline material. The world interpreted it as coldness, but Paul later explained he was in shock, barely able to process the loss. Crying on camera felt impossible. His awkward understatement hid a storm of emotions. Decades later, he admitted he regretted the words, knowing they failed to capture what John meant to him. The wound Chapman created wasn't just personal. It was creative, cultural, and permanent. McCartney later said that Chapman stole a piece of the Beatles' soul. For years, the cracks between Paul and John had seemed impossible to heal. Creative arguments, public jabs, and lawsuits kept them apart. And yet, in the late 1970s, the two had begun tentatively reconnecting. Friends recalled that they had even discussed the idea of writing together again. If true, the music world lost not only Lennon, but the possibility of one last Lennon-McCartney collaboration, snatched away in an instant by a stranger with a gun. This was different from every other name on Paul's private blacklist. Business betrayal could be settled in courts. Studio clashes could be fought with letters, or by remixing an album decades later. Rivalries with bandmates, however bitter, left open the door for reconciliation. Chapman's act slammed that door shut forever. The crime took not only John's life, but Paul's chance at closure, apology, or even forgiveness. It left McCartney with nothing but silence and what-ifs. When asked about Chapman, Paul has never softened his words. He has called him a coward and a psycho, saying that the act wasn't just homicide, but the deliberate destruction of something irreplaceable. Fans could remember the Beatles, play their records, and relive the concerts, but for Paul, every tribute carried the shadow of absence. The four would never stand together again, and Chapman was the man who ensured it. For McCartney, anger at Chapman was never about rivalry or bruised pride. It was about grief. Unlike the others on this list, Chapman represents something Paul never had the power to fix. Every Beatles reunion rumor, every anniversary tribute, every performance of yesterday is haunted by what Chapman stole. In Paul's eyes, there is no forgiveness here. If Chapman ended the chance to heal, the next name turned trust into a business trap that cut straight to Paul's pride. Number 7. Michael Jackson. In the early 1980s, Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson shared an unlikely but genuine friendship. They recorded duets like The Girl Is Mine and Say, 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 spent time together off stage, and even spoke of each other as if they were family. Paul saw Michael as a younger brother in the industry, someone to guide and encourage. One night, in what seemed like a harmless conversation, Paul shared a tip that had secured his own financial future. Invest in music publishing. Owning song rights, he explained, meant steady income and long-term power in the industry. He had quietly purchased rights to songs written by others, ensuring royalties rolled in for decades. Michael listened carefully. Paul never imagined what would come next. In 1985, ATV Music Publishing, the company that owned the majority of the Beatles' catalog, went up for sale. To Paul, these songs were not only priceless, they were personal, the crown jewels of his career. He hoped to secure them for himself. But Michael, then at the peak of his stardom, had both the money and the ambition to make a move. For a reported $47.5 million, Michael Jackson outbid all competitors and walked away with the Beatles' catalog in his hands. For Paul, it was more than just a business defeat. It felt like a betrayal. He had been the one to encourage Michael to pursue publishing. Never in his worst thoughts did he expect Jackson to use that advice to acquire the very songs Paul had poured his life into. To Paul, it was like handing a friend the key to your safe, only to watch him walk away with your most valuable possession. The fracture in their friendship was swift and lasting. Their once playful collaborations turned into cold silence. When Michael later faced financial struggles, many assumed he would sell the Beatles songs back to McCartney, but that moment never came. Instead, Jackson partnered with Sony, merging the catalog into Sony ATV, one of the most powerful publishing companies in the world. For Paul, each move was another reminder that his music he had written and performed, was controlled by someone else. The sting cut especially deep because song rights had long been Paul's obsession. More than many of his peers, he understood the business side of music. He had seen how publishing could secure an artist's future and had worked tirelessly to build a financial empire around it. Having those rights slip into the hands of a man he had once called a brother was, for him, a humiliation layered on top of heartbreak. In later interviews, Paul tried to describe the wound. He said he thought Michael's purchase was just business, but the bitterness was obvious. "I thought we were friends," Paul remarked, the words simple but heavy with hurt. Over time, Paul managed to buy back many of his publishing rights. But the memory of Michael's move never left him. It wasn't the money, it was the betrayal, the knowledge that his own advice had been turned against him in the most personal way possible. Number 6. Alan Klein. When Beatles manager Brian Epstein died suddenly in 1967, the group lost more than a friend. They lost the one person who had kept their sprawling empire in order. The Beatles were a cultural phenomenon, but their company, Apple Corp., was bleeding money through failed side projects, film ventures, and unchecked expenses. By 1969, the band urgently needed a strong manager. That search created one of the deepest divides between Paul McCartney and the rest of the group. Enter Alan Klein. Known for his tough negotiating style, Klein had built a reputation as the man who could get artists more money from record companies. He had managed the Rolling Stones, Sam Cooke, and others, earning both praise and suspicion. John Lennon was drawn to Klein immediately. Lennon admired Klein's blunt, no-nonsense approach, famously saying Klein was the only one who told it like it was. George Harrison and Ringo Starr also fell in line, impressed by Klein's promises of stability and riches. Paul, however, wanted nothing to do with him. McCartney distrusted Klein from the start, describing him as too slick, too charming, and ultimately self-serving. Instead, Paul argued passionately for the Eastmans, his new in-laws, to take on the band's affairs. He trusted them, not least because they were family, but also because they had experience in law and management. This disagreement split the Beatles down the middle. When Lennon, Harrison, and Starr officially signed with Klein, Paul stood alone, refusing to add his name to the contract. The fallout was brutal. Klein immediately reshaped Apple Corp., cutting staff and reining in projects. Short-term, profits improved, and on the surface, it looked like he had saved the company. But Paul believed it was smoke and mirrors. He was convinced Klein was enriching himself while the Beatles' long-term control slipped away. What angered Paul most was that his bandmates could not, or would not, see what he saw. To him, Klein was a fox in the henhouse, and the others were too dazzled by his charm to notice the feathers flying. The tension boiled over when Paul, isolated, took the unprecedented step of suing his own bandmates in 1970. It was the only way to dissolve the group legally and sever ties with Klein. The lawsuit shocked fans worldwide, painting Paul as the man who broke up the Beatles. To the public, it looked like betrayal. To Paul, it felt like the only way to save the music they had built together. Years later, time would prove Paul's suspicions well-founded. Klein was eventually found guilty of questionable financial practices, overcharging commissions, and withholding royalties. The very bandmates who once dismissed Paul's warnings admitted, in hindsight, that he had been right not to trust Klein. But vindication came at a terrible cost. By then, the Beatles were gone, and Paul's public image had suffered. He was seen as the cold businessman, the one who turned lawyers against friends, when in reality, he had been trying to protect their collective legacy. For Paul, Klein symbolized everything he despised in the music industry. Someone who weaponized contracts, manipulated egos, and thrived in chaos. More than losing money, Paul hated the way Klein drove a wedge between men who had once been brothers. Even after Klein's fall, Paul never forgave what he saw as a betrayal of trust at the most fragile moment in the Beatles' story. It wasn't simply that Klein hurt the Beatles financially. He had exploited the cracks in their friendship and widened them until nothing remained but lawyers and silence. Number 5. Phil Spector. If Alan Klein was the manager Paul never wanted, Phil Spector was the producer Paul never asked for. By 1969, the Beatles' Get Back project was meant to strip things down. 4 musicians, live instruments, and no gimmicks. Paul envisioned it as a return to basics, a counterweight to the studio tricks that had dominated their later albums. But by the time the sessions wrapped, the band was exhausted. Tensions were high, and the recordings felt messy. Into this chaos stepped Phil Spector. Spector was famous for his wall of sound, a production style packed with layered instruments, choirs, and dramatic orchestration. Lennon and Harrison admired him, seeing in Spector a genius who could salvage the tapes. Alan Klein brought him on board to finalize the album, and suddenly Paul's stripped-down vision was out of his hands. The result horrified him. The most painful blow came with The Long and Winding Road. Written by Paul as an intimate, fragile ballad, the song was buried under a lush symphony of strings, brass, and a women's choir. Paul had wanted vulnerability. What he got sounded to him like Hollywood melodrama. To make matters worse, some of his original vocal takes were erased to make room for the orchestral overdubs. Paul sat stunned as he heard the final mix, his own song transformed into something he barely recognized. His response was sharp and immediate. Paul wrote a scathing letter demanding that Klein and Spector strip away the excess, get the strings, the brass, the choir off. His words cut like a blade, but they were ignored. The album Let It Be was released in May 1970 with Spector's grandiose production intact. The album went to number 1, but Paul viewed it as a hollow victory. To him, it was proof that he had lost control not just of the band, but of his own art. The anger lingered for decades. George Martin, the Beatles' longtime producer, openly criticized Spector's heavy hand, famously saying, "The record should have been credited. Produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector." Paul himself spoke bitterly about how his music had been twisted without his consent. Fans loved The Long and Winding Road as it charted worldwide, but Paul could never enjoy its success. Each time the radio played it, he heard someone else's fingerprints smothering his own. For a man who fought so hard for precision and clarity, it was like being forced to watch an artist vandalize his painting while the world applauded. And yet, 33 years later, Paul found a way to reclaim it. In 2003, he oversaw Let It Be, Naked, a stripped-down version of the album that erased Spector's orchestration and restored the raw takes. The long and winding road returned to the way Paul had written it, simple, plaintive, and unadorned. It was more than a remix. It was a statement. For Paul, it was justice at last, an overdue chance to tell the world, "This is my song, and no one else gets to decide how it sounds." Still, the scars of that fight never truly healed. To McCartney, Spector embodied the violation of artistic trust, proof that even a Beatle could lose control of his own music. And perhaps most painfully, it showed that success alone could not shield him, that even at the top of the world, he was still vulnerable to betrayal. But Spector wasn't the only person who turned music into a weapon. Paul's closest partner did it too. Number 4. John Lennon. No name on Paul McCartney's private blacklist carries more weight than John Lennon. Together, they were the creative core of the Beatles, a songwriting duo that defined an era. Lennon-McCartney wasn't just a credit line, it was a symbol of unity, brotherhood, and genius. Yet behind the brand, the bond began to crack. By the late 1960s, creative differences pulled them in opposite directions. John sought freedom, raw expression, and often chaos. Paul wanted structure, polish, and direction. Lifestyle choices added fuel. Lennon's embrace of avant-garde art and illegal substances clashed with Paul's image as the pragmatic craftsman. Add to that the financial confusion at Apple Corp after Brian Epstein's death, and the pressure cooker was set. Inside the studio, the tension was palpable. Paul's perfectionism often left others frustrated, while Lennon's restless energy drove him to rebel against the very band that had made him famous. The result was a rivalry that blurred the lines between professional and personal. What once had been playful competition turned into bitterness. To Paul, it was as though his brother had become his adversary. That bitterness spilled onto vinyl. Lennon's 1971 track, How Do You Sleep, was a direct attack, mocking Paul's career and sneering that the only thing he had done was yesterday. It was brutal, personal, and public. For Paul, hearing his former partner weaponize music against him was a wound deeper than tabloids or lawsuits. But McCartney wasn't passive. In Too Many People, released the same year, Paul inserted barbed lyrics aimed squarely at John and Yoko, accusing them of taking their lucky break and breaking it in two. The feud became a battle of songs, proof that even when at war, music was still their common language. Yet under the venom lay something more complicated: longing. Despite the anger, both men occasionally admitted their deep connection had never vanished. Friends recalled moments when John and Paul spoke of each other with affection, even after the public jabs. In the late 1970s, their communication warmed. Stories surfaced of the two chatting on the phone, joking like old friends, and even considering writing together again. Paul later said he believed they were on the brink of reconciliation, perhaps even a return to collaboration in some form. Then came December 8, 1980. Mark David Chapman's bullets didn't just neutralize John Lennon, they slain the possibility of closure. For Paul, the grief was complicated. Anger and rivalry mixed with love and regret. He had been denied the chance to sit across from John one more time, to laugh, to argue, to maybe even say, "I'm sorry." That unfinished conversation remains one of the great tragedies of Paul's life. McCartney has often struggled with how to remember John in public. He acknowledges the rivalry and the fights, but never hides the admiration either. He knows that Lennon was both storm and sunshine, brother and rival. And perhaps that is why Paul's feelings toward John can't be reduced to hatred. They are something far more complex, a love story cut short by violence. Number 3. Yoko Ono. For Paul McCartney, the late 1960s brought not just new musical experiments, but new personalities in the studio, most notably Yoko Ono. Before 1968, recording sessions for the Beatles had been almost sacred spaces. Only the four members, producer George Martin, and a few trusted engineers were present. That intimacy, Paul felt, was the secret ingredient behind their creative chemistry. But when John Lennon began bringing Yoko to every session, sitting right beside him as the band worked, the dynamic shifted. For Paul, who prized focus and routine, her constant presence felt like an intrusion. What John saw as intimacy, Paul experienced as disruption. Tensions didn't stay hidden. Paul later admitted he resented the change, not Yoko's relationship with John, but her active involvement in the group's creative discussions. For him, the Beatles were a closed circle, and her presence broke that boundary. To Lennon, Yoko's involvement was proof of devotion. To Paul, it looked like interference. This cultural clash was one of the first visible cracks in the Lennon-McCartney partnership. But the resentment went deeper than just who sat in on sessions. After Lennon's death in 1980, Paul found himself wrestling with a new, highly sensitive issue: songwriting credits. Since the early days, Beatles songs were credited as Lennon-McCartney, regardless of who had done most of the writing. For Paul, this had been tolerable when the partnership was alive, but after John's passing, it became a matter of legacy. Paul suggested changing some credits to McCartney-Lennon for songs he primarily wrote. Yoko objected fiercely, seeing it as an attempt to diminish John's place in history. What might have been a quiet correction in another band became a very public battle. Paul insisted he only wanted accuracy. Yoko viewed it as an act of rewriting the Beatles' story. The dispute stretched across interviews, legal wrangling, and decades of simmering hostility. In one Rolling Stone poll in the early 1980s, Yoko even went as far as ranking Paul as the least important Beatle, a remark that stung deeply. And yet, time did not entirely harden the ice. By the 1990s, when Paul, George, and Ringo reunited to create the Beatles Anthology Project, Yoko's cooperation was essential. She controlled Lennon's archive, and she gave her approval for the use of John's demo recordings, which the remaining Beatles built into new songs. The collaboration showed that some civility had returned, but trust was another matter. Publicly, both Paul and Yoko offered polite remarks about each other, but there was always an undertone of rivalry. McCartney later summed it up with a telling phrase: "I don't hate Yoko, but I didn't like what happened when she came into the picture." For Paul, Yoko Ono represented more than a personality clash. She symbolized a turning point, the moment when the Beatles' once seamless unity fractured under outside influence. Even decades later, the frost between them never fully melted. Their uneasy truce was built on necessity, not reconciliation. Number 2. George Harrison. If John Lennon was Paul's great rival and Yoko Ono his greatest irritant, then George Harrison was the quiet but simmering tension within the Beatles. From the start, Paul and George had very different roles in the band. Paul was the meticulous architect, shaping arrangements with an exacting ear. George was the youngest Beatle, the lead guitarist who slowly grew into a songwriter of his own. But as the years went on, Paul's perfectionism often clashed with George's pride. The Let It Be sessions in 1969 made this conflict painfully clear. Paul, frustrated with the band's lack of focus, began dictating parts in the studio, even down to George's guitar line. For a man eager to prove himself as more than just the other guitarist, this was infuriating. George's patience snapped one day after repeated instructions from Paul. He delivered the now famous line, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." His sarcasm cut through the room, capturing years of pent-up resentment. Not long after, George walked out entirely, leaving the band stunned. He returned a few days later, but the damage was done. This wasn't just a matter of bruised egos, it was about recognition. By the late 1960s, George was blossoming as a songwriter. Songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun proved he could stand shoulder to shoulder with Lennon and McCartney. Yet in the studio, Paul's controlling tendencies often left George feeling sidelined. Guitar solos he worked out were replaced. His songwriting contributions were minimized. Even his creative ideas for arrangements were sometimes brushed aside. To George, it felt as though Paul saw him as an accessory rather than an equal. The friction didn't vanish after the Beatles split. In later years, George was frank about the difficulties of working with Paul. He once remarked, "Playing with Paul is like being tied down. It's difficult to do anything." For a man who valued independence and spiritual growth, Paul's relentless drive felt suffocating. Paul often praised George in public, but the professional tension between them was palpable. Paul regarded George his baby brother when George died in 2001, an indication that great affection was shown toward George. But deep inside, he cherished an alienation reality. Their working relationship was contrasting more often than being harmonious. But in spite of their clashes, there were times of reconciliation. George and Paul did their work together sideways every now and then, especially during the Beatles anthology project a decade ago. The old pains were still around, softened by the life of age and perspective. Yet, George had never really pardoned Paul for so many years of being overwhelmed. So, Paul ended up staying wounded in terms of professional progress, knowing full well that this uncompromising drive for creativity in every way, besides bringing him as much acclaim, has also been the very cause of one too many failed friendships. It was the whole point of somewhat of their great lives. George stood on the front line. All his life, he tried to remain his own person, as an individual, a person who knows himself better than all these pressing judges, treading him like a fool for being known as an invisible collaborator. George Harrison may not the motive of hidden hatred within Paul, but it was personal resentment that would not heal into its regular disguise. Theirs was a complicated relationship of brotherhood, professional problems, and deep hostility, a testament to how even in the Beatles, peace could not be assured. And beyond all that, a crooner from another era added a final, nagging sting. Number 1. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra may not have been a close friend or collaborator of Paul McCartney's, but his shadow loomed large. To Paul, Sinatra represented an earlier era of music, polished, romantic, rooted in jazz and swing. McCartney had grown up admiring that world, and in many ways, he respected Sinatra as one of the greatest vocalists of all time. Yet, admiration didn't mean immunity from insult. Over time, Paul found himself on the receiving end of barbs that stung more than casual criticism. They carried the weight of a generational divide. Sinatra often dismissed rock and roll, the very movement Paul and the Beatles had helped ignite across the globe. To Sinatra, rock was noise, a rancid-smelling aphrodisiac for unruly youth. Comments like that weren't aimed solely at Paul, but they struck at the heart of what he stood for. To McCartney, rock was liberation, experimentation, and the voice of his generation. Hearing one of his idols reduce it to garbage was less a personal insult than a slap in the face to an entire culture. But things became more personal when Sinatra took aim at one of Paul's proudest achievements, Yesterday. The song was already a phenomenon, covered by countless artists and celebrated for its simplicity and beauty. Yet Sinatra reportedly mocked it as the saddest song ever written and joked about its melancholy tone. To the public, such remarks might have seemed harmless banter. For Paul, whose sensitivity to criticism ran deep, it was cutting. Yesterday wasn't just another song, it was a piece of his heart, a melody born from vulnerability. To hear it ridiculed by a legend he respected was a wound disguised as a quip. Another slight came in the form of a mistake that may have been unintentional, but still carried weight. When performing George Harrison's Something, Sinatra once introduced it as the greatest love song Lennon and McCartney ever wrote. The crowd applauded, but the error left Paul exasperated. Not only did it erase Harrison's authorship, it reinforced the lazy shorthand that every Beatles song was a Lennon-McCartney creation. For Paul, who already felt the burden of constantly defending his contributions, such misattributions, especially from someone as prominent as Sinatra, were galling. Unlike with figures such as Michael Jackson or Alan Klein, Paul's frustration with Sinatra wasn't about betrayal or contracts. It was about respect, or rather, the lack of it. Sinatra represented the old guard, the musical establishment that viewed the Beatles as noisy upstarts rather than legitimate artists. For McCartney, who had spent his life proving that rock music could stand alongside the great standards, Sinatra's words were reminders that not everyone would ever see him as an equal. Still, Paul never turned the tension into open war. Unlike his sparring with John or his feuds with Yoko, his irritation with Sinatra remained mostly unspoken, a quiet wound tucked away. Sinatra may not have broken friendships or altered careers, but his dismissals lingered in Paul's memory. They were small, yet sharp reminders that even legends could bruise each other's pride. Some wounds came from greed, some from ego, and one from a gun. McCartney has often chosen silence, music, and time over public score settling, and perhaps that is why his legacy endures. If you want the full story behind each name, with quotes, sessions, and sources, like, comment, and subscribe. Then watch the next video on your screen for more deep dives into the myths and truths behind music's biggest legends.